If you like what I do, consider joining my channel or donating to my coffee. Links in the description.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
You underestimate my power!
Don't try it!
So, I didn't know what a Satgat was until this game. It's a wide-brimmed hat traditionally woven with straw or bamboo, typically associated with Korea. I always called them rice paddy hats because that's what I had always heard them referred to as, but that sounded kind of racist, so I never said it out loud. Anyway, The Devil Within Satgat has finally left early access. I've had my eye on this game for a couple of reasons. One, it stars a demon-possessed samurai. No further explanation needed. And two, the combat looked flashy as f***, boy, and I sure do love purty lights with my fighting. There was also the veiled threat that this game was a Souls-like, which, of course, meant I had to try it out. If you've been following my channel, you know I love a good Soulsvania. So, what's the game about? In The Devil Within Satgat, you play as Kim Rip, aka Mr. Satgat, a man on a military mission to take down the Ebon Sting, some kind of demonic tower that's appeared in his homeland. Why destroy the tower? Well, other than that it's demonic, it also excretes crimson oil, a resource once thought to be revolutionary until it started corrupting people and turning them into violent zombies. So, of course, when Mr. Satgat reaches the top of the tower, he's able to destroy it uncontested because obviously nobody in their right mind would be so power hungry to betray him. Well, anyway, Mr. Satgat awakens to find he's lost all of his memories and that he's been possessed by a devil that's within him. It's the devil within. Satgat! Now, Mr. Satgat must venture forth to unravel the mysteries of who he is and what he can do to save his homeland. Good enough setup for me, but does it make for a good Metroidvania?
Combat.
As mentioned earlier, we got ourselves a Soulsvania, boys. For the uninitiated, that's a combination of Souls-like and Metroidvania. What's that mean for combat? Typically it means you're going to become well acquainted with the game over screen and become accustomed to running back to your corpse to retrieve all your currency. Typically. The Devil Within Satgat, though mildly challenging, isn't nearly as ruthless as other games of its ilk. And as the game progresses and you unlock better skills, get better artifacts, and find and enhance better gear, its bite becomes less and less threatening. It wasn't until the game's penultimate boss fight that I really saw a steep difficulty spike. What made this encounter so challenging? Parrying, baby! I don't want to get into the specifics of the boss fight for spoilers' sake. I just want you to know parrying exists in this game, and you better get really good at it if you want to complete it. Or you can always just go into the options screen whenever you want and change the difficulty to easy. Whatever gets you that victory. I won't tell anyone. Anyway, let's get into combat proper. Mr. Satgat has himself a katana and a gun. With his sword, he has a weak and heavy attack. Mr. Satgat initially starts with a 3-hit ground combo with his weak attack and a 2-hit ground combo with his heavy attack. And he starts with no air combos, which is kind of a bummer. Of course, you can eventually unlock much more by leveling up and using the numerous skill trees at Mr. Satgat's disposal, but I'll get into those details in the progression section. For now, just know that Mr. Satgat starts with some measly combos with the sword, but that changes once you start leveling up. By mid-game, you should have a very impressive repertoire of very fun approaches toward dismembering and disemboweling your opponents. This is my way of saying combat starts very basic, but revs up to be very fun and interesting as you progress. Before I get into all of Mr. Satgat's defensive maneuvers, I want to quickly talk about his guns. I was only able to find 2 guns in the entire game, but I assume there are more and I just suck at finding them. Anyway, the gun, it's a gun. You press the left trigger and fire with the right. It feels good and is actually a viable option for damage. I've played so many games where guns really don't do much in combat other than doing chip damage and sustaining your combo, but in The Devil Within, the gun can do some actual damage. And it apparently runs on batteries. Each shot expends a portion of your battery, and once your battery is used up, your gun is done, son. Unless you use items. Items can be used in real time or from the pause menu, and they range from recharging your battery to generating a barrier that absorbs damage to your tried and true Estus flask, which in this game are berries. Eat a berry when your HP is low and replenish those berries at campfires. It's been done before, but I love it. Alright, with offense out of the way, let's talk defense. Mr. Satgat has a couple of ways to defend himself, dodging and parrying. And each of these maneuvers requires the use of AP, ability points. This is essentially your stamina bar. Weak attacks and jumping do not use AP, but heavy attacks, special attacks, and defensive maneuvers do use AP. And when your AP is exhausted, so is Mr. Satgat, meaning he can't dodge, parry, or use special skills until he's recovered. Now, there is a way to parry and dodge so that it doesn't expend your AP, and that's by being perfect. With a perfect parry or a perfect dodge, which means doing these maneuvers right as an enemy would make contact, you negate all damage while preserving your AP, and you do a counterattack. But if you have CP, concentration points, these little purple spikes that fill up as you attack, instead of doing a standard counterattack, you'll instead enter the concentrated state. The concentrated state is kind of like witch time or bullet time. The screen turns all negative, time slows down, and Mr. Satgat can slowly move himself around and is given some options for destruction. Choosing one of these three options initiates a powerful counterattack skill that expends CP. It's almost always a good idea to choose violence in these situations, but you do have the option to cancel the concentrated state if you want to preserve your CP. There is one more thing Mr. Satgat can do much later in the game that involves this meter that looks like a face. It comes with a cooldown, and once it's ready to use, Mr. Satgat can initiate his devil trigger like he were Dante. Technically, the transformation is called Devil Eyes, and it changes everything about Mr. Satgat. He looks different, he moves faster, he hits harder, and all of the Devil's combos are unique in this form. Its one big drawback is that your HP depletes the entire time you're devilized. However, every successful strike replenishes your HP, and this form doesn't have a set duration. So, it's possible to stay devilized indefinitely as long as you can keep your HP up or don't cancel it out yourself. And that's the basics for the Devil Within's combat, which is a lot but not overwhelming. Much of what's going on here combat-wise should feel familiar to action game enthusiasts. All we have left to talk about are the actual enemy and boss encounters. The regular enemies you encounter in the game are going to fall under two categories, standard and elite. Standard enemies are your typical fodder you use to sharpen your blade and skills. You hit them, they get stunned by your hits, and you continue hitting them until they die. Elite enemies, on the other hand, are much larger and do not stagger. Instead, you'll need to take advantage of the game's shock mechanic, which is basically this game's poise meter. It's the yellow meter under an enemy's health bar, and as you hit them with skills and heavy attacks and perfect parries and dodges, shock will accumulate. Once this bar is full, the enemy will stagger, opening themselves up for a special skill called Soul Destruction, a high damaging attack that elite enemies will rarely survive. Bosses, on the other hand, can endure 3 or more of these bad boys. Bosses, by and large, are pretty good. Besides the penultimate boss I mentioned earlier, I really didn't have too much trouble with the bosses, which is unusual for me in a Souls-like. I found each boss engaging and fun to fight for what that's worth. But if you're looking for a challenge, maybe play this game on hard. For all the non-masochists out there, The Devil Within Satgat might be a good introduction to Souls-likes due to its accessibility and the emphasis on crushing difficulty. There's still challenge to be had, don't get me wrong, just not enough to make every boss encounter feel like you're banging your head against a wall. And that'll do it for combat. The Devil Within Satgat is a very combat-focused experience, and the combat on offer is fun, addictive, and feels really good. Every perfect parry is a triumph, and slicing through hordes of zombies and beasts is as cathartic as it is enjoyable.
Abilities. Platforming.
The abilities in The Devil Within crosses that blurry line between being organic upgrades and being glorified keys. This is just a psychological thing or a feeling or a vibe, so it's not gonna be a big issue for a majority of players, but it does kinda irk me as a Metroidvania. What do I mean by the blurry line between feeling organic and feeling like glorified keys? Essentially, it all comes down to the game's linearity, and The Devil Within is a very linear game, which I'll go into much more detail in the exploration section. For the ability section, what this means is that abilities are always given to you exactly when you need them so you can progress in the game's straight line, hence the glorified key feeling. Like I said, it's just a mindset kind of thing that makes the game feel less like a Metroidvania. I'll go over it more deeply in the exploration section. As for the game's abilities necessary to overcome utility gating, There's only one move here that's unique, and that's the chasing grasp. The other abilities are double jump and wall jump, and you get both of those closely together and pretty early in the game. I would like to say both of these skills, though functional, are not my favorite iterations the genre has to offer. The double jump barely gives you added length or height, and the wall jump pushes you off the wall at a set distance. Neither of these things are a concern nor affect gameplay by any means. I was just surprised at how much I didn't like them compared to other double jumps and wall jumps in other MVs. The air dash felt pretty good though, but you get that way too late in the game in my humble of humblest opinions. Let's talk about the chasing grasp, as this will transition us straight into the game's platforming. I had a love-hate relationship with the chasing grasp. You press and hold the trigger until your target is confirmed, then you release the button to zoom over and smack your target with your demonic arm. It's a great concept and worked consistently well in combat situations, but for some reason I could not get this thing to work consistently on these bats. Whenever you see a line of bats flying by, the objective was to use your chasing grasp on them to elevate yourself to higher platforms. But for whatever reason, I always had trouble proccing my claw on them. It was never a huge issue because these sections were never in stressful situations, but it was annoying all the same. To round out the rest of the game's platforming, it was okay. Mr. Satgat felt good to control, and there were hardly any sections that required platforming prowess over a 5th grade level. Considering combat is this game's main focus, I was good with the lack of platforming challenge, except in the purgatory parts later in the game. Those parts can go straight to hell. That'll do it for this section. There's not a whole lot exciting going on with the traversal abilities outside of the chasing grasp, and that for some reason didn't work as well as I wanted it to in the platforming parts where it was needed. As for the platforming, it's serviceable enough in that you can adequately jump and platform to your combat encounters.
Progression.
Alright, this is where the devil within gets addicting. This is what I love the most about Souls-likes. You kill enemies, gain souls, or in this game's case, engrams, and then level up at campfires. It's a fun gameplay loop I just never get tired of, especially after having went a long time between campfires through a really tough section. Reaching that new campfire and leveling up just feels so good. So, what do you level up in this game? It's a little different, but I ultimately enjoyed it. Unlike most Souls-likes or Soulsvanias, you don't level stats. Instead, each level gives you multiple factors. Factors are tough to explain, but easy to understand. Think of a factor as a skill point. Factors come in 5 colors, and each color corresponds with a specific skill tree, with there being a total of 7 skill trees to enhance by the end of the game. The easiest to understand are the yellow biofactors that are used exclusively in the physical ability skill tree. In this skill tree, you'll be increasing VIT, which is vitality or HP, attack, and battery, which is ammo for your gun. Easy enough, right? Next, let's talk about the red aggression factor. These go into the swordsmanship skill tree and unlock special moves and combos. However, some of the nodes in this tree require other colored factors to unlock. It's not uncommon to need 2 red factors, a teal factor, and a blue factor to unlock something in this tree. You ever play Magic the Gathering? Think of the factors like mana. You want to unlock this attack? Tap 2 mountains, an island, and a plain to get the mana necessary to cast the spell. God, as if this channel couldn't get any more nerdy. And that's basically how you improve Mr. Satgat in this game. Kill stuff, use the engrams gained by killing stuff at campfires to level up, and use the colored factors from leveling up to unlock stuff in the game's numerous skill trees. I can see how all these skill trees may feel overwhelming at first, but color coding the factors and the skill trees helps out a lot. As for Mr. Satgat's weaponry, these can be improved through refinement at campfires and require materials to do so. These materials are mostly dropped by enemies, but can also be purchased at shops once shops become available. It's a simple crafting system made more simple due to the small variety of crafting materials to be found. I like this approach. Remember, simple is not a dirty word on my channel. The last thing Mr. Satgat can update are his berries, which is this game's Estus flask. You find colored fruit while exploring and use this fruit to increase your berries' usage and effectiveness. There are a few other things Mr. Satgat can utilize to improve himself. Accessories and artifacts. You have 2 slots for accessories, and accessories can do a plethora of things, such as increasing your vitality, giving you damage reduction, increasing your movement speed, etc. Artifacts, on the other hand, are a completely different beast. First off, you don't have to equip artifacts. Every artifact you find automatically equips, so to speak. Basically, they just keep stacking, so you never have to worry about them. And artifacts can do all kinds of stuff, from giving you a brand new ability, to increasing your crit damage, to allowing you to survive mortal damage at 1 HP. Mostly you'll find artifacts after defeating bosses, completing arena fights that pop up here and there as you're exploring, or by opening the silver and gold chests found throughout the game's maps. More on those in the exploration section. Needless to say, finding artifacts was always a treat and one of the game's major highlights. As far as side quests are concerned, there are none given by NPCs, but you can find memory shards that unlock after you kill X amount of some enemy. And your reward for killing the enemies is engrams and lore. And yeah, that's all the game's side quests. It's an interesting kind of side quest, but I would have liked to have seen some more variety. And that'll do it for progression. The lack of real side quests is kind of disappointing, but everything else about the Devil Within's progression systems is exactly what I like in my Soulsvanias. Gather XP, level up, and use skill points in skill trees. Weapon enhancement was also rewarding, and I appreciated its simplicity. At the end of the day, the Devil Within really just wants you to get out there to explore and kill things, and I could definitely get behind that. Speaking of exploring,
Exploration.
this is where I'm conflicted the most about the Devil Within. I find its exploration equal parts rewarding and unrewarding. I'll do my best to explain. Exploration's rewarding in that I love coming across enemies. Whether the enemy is standard or elite, I loved hacking through them. The combat in this game just feels so good. And if I did take down an elite enemy, I was rewarded with a silver key, which I could then use to unlock silver chests full of great things like accessories or artifacts or factors I could use in my skill trees. However, exploration fell flat in some key areas. Firstly, this game is level-based. You can always return to previous biomes, and there will be a time when backtracking is necessary. But, by and large, backtracking isn't something you have to do to progress outside of this one brief moment late game. But the worst part is trying to get to previous biomes. The entirety of the Devil Within's map is not interconnected, and thus you have to use a statue to move between biomes, ultimately solidifying the feeling that these aren't biomes, they're levels. Much like the blurred line I mentioned earlier when discussing abilities, having biomes feel like levels is a psychological thing that affects the player more than it affects the actual game. So, your mileage may vary on these types of critiques. As a Metroidvania who's looking for specific aspects to scratch that Metroidvania itch, I get deeply disappointed when biomes feel like levels. However, this may not be an issue for you whatsoever, so feel free to disregard this aspect of my critique. That's all the negative stuff regarding exploration. I want to return to the good stuff because there's a lot to like here. I mentioned how combat's its own reward and how obtaining keys and using them on the chests scattered throughout the map is also rewarding. But I didn't mention the little puppies you can find. They're called Heitai, and finding them reveals a segment of the map as well as gives you a special scale that can be used to purchase things at a specific shop. You can also happen upon different swords and guns, but it was pretty rare. I only found 1 additional gun in my playthrough and 3 additional swords, not counting the Excalibur. The in-game map is freaking amazing. It's highly detailed, has breadcrumbing, utilizes a fog of war feature to show where you have and haven't been, and there's no need to mark it up because every point of interest is marked for you automatically. And the fast travel, you unlock it pretty early and you can travel between every unlocked save point within a biome. It'd have been great to fast travel between biomes instead of relying on that stupid statue, but it's really not that big of a deal. Overall, fast travel, chef's kiss. There are a couple of other things to find while exploring, such as Corruptor's memory shards. These are found where you fought a biome's boss and are used to rematch that boss for rewards. Honestly, I wasn't a fan of this mechanic. Each boss rematch comes with 9 different levels, each with their own reward, and I just didn't find it enjoyable fighting these bosses 9 additional times because, regardless of the chosen level, bosses never changed up their movesets or aggression. At least, not in a significant way that I noticed. They just seem to get more HP and hit harder, which is the laziest way to increase difficulty. But these rematches were the only way to get golden keys to unlock the golden chests hidden throughout the various maps. And the goodies inside these chests sometimes were worth the monotony of these boss fights, though the multiple fights against the administrator were not worth it. And that'll do it for exploration. I personally hate how level-based all the biomes are, how there's 0 interconnectivity, and how you have to use special statues to travel between biomes, but that ultimately and likely won't affect how much fun you're going to have with The Devil Within. Exploration's still rewarding with its numerous combat encounters, unlocking of treasure chests, and puppy finding. Add on the progression system's addictiveness, and you're going to have yourself a fun 10 or so hours.
Atmosphere. Narrative.
I really don't have a lot to say about the game's atmosphere. I can give it the highest praise I could ever give a 2.5D Metroidvania by saying I think the game looks pretty good and is animated very well. I hate how rare that is for 2.5D MVs, but I'm pleased to say The Devil Within, in fact, looks pretty good and is animated very well. The game's also completely voice acted, or voice whispered if you're talking about the literal devil within Mr. Satgat. I'm not the best judge of voice actors' quality, but I found the English voice work to be a little hokey. Like, none of the voice work was bad, but sometimes questions were asked in a weird tone. It's a tiny nitpick that I found endearing and funny, if anything. It definitely added more to the experience than it took away, that's for sure. As for the environments, they all looked pretty good. There were even times when the game would take a breather, push back the camera, and allow players to take in the game's gorgeous backdrops. As far as music goes, I, for the life of me, can't remember anything except the sweet track that played when you devilized. I mean, it was no Devil Trigger from Devil May Cry 5, but it was still pretty awesome. Now, just because I can't really remember the music doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. I popped the game back in to listen to the tracks to refresh my memory, and each track is high quality stuff that does the job, and sometimes that's good enough. When it comes to the narrative, I found it to be equally as serviceable. Full disclosure, I read absolutely none of the lore items in this game, of which there were a ton to find. I found the game's plot to be easily understood through its cutscenes and environmental storytelling. There was really no reason to bring reading into this. But perhaps diving deeper into these texts may add some value to your playtime, so take my unwillingness to read anything with a grain of salt. The narrative overall is alright. It's a tale of betrayal, revenge, and redemption, but also zombies and demons and stuff. The game does a good job of doling out information, so I don't think anyone will have trouble following along. The ending was kind of just okay. They do a twist that kind of works, but would have worked better if the land of Mirabel was fleshed out more. But, in the game's defense, I didn't read any of the lore items, so maybe Mirabel was super fleshed out and I just didn't read about it. Also, there's only one ending, so there's that. And that's it for this section. The biggest takeaway here is that The Devil Within looks great, especially for a 2.5D Metroidvania.
Final thoughts and score.
The Devil Within Satgat is a compelling entry into the Souls-like and Soulsvania genres due in part to its accessibility. It has everything you'd want in a Souls-like: intense combat, addictive progression systems, and rewarding exploration, but without the crushing difficulty. Though I did not play the game on hard mode, so maybe the difficulty is there for those who seek it. Additionally, The Devil Within is visually impressive, with smooth animations and clean textures that build out its world without scorching my eyeballs. Performance-wise, there were a couple of hiccups, such as textures not loading quickly enough after fast travel, but I never experienced any performance issues that affected gameplay. I award The Devil Within Satgat an 8 out of 10. The Devil Within Satgat is available on PC and PlayStation 5. I played it entirely on my Steam Deck with 0 issues, and thus give the game a Steam Deck rating of verified.
Pair placement.
The Devil Within Satgat is a very fun game for those seeking a combat-focused experience with their exploration. However, some Metroidvanias are going to be let down by the game's linearity and level-based approach. The Devil Within Satgat possesses the B tier. While it excels in its polished combat and aesthetics, The Devil Within Satgat's linear structure and limited exploration keep it from reaching the heights of A or S tier. It's a solid entry that fans of Soulsvanias and action-oriented MVs will enjoy, but it may not fully satisfy players looking for deep exploration or groundbreaking innovation. But if you're just looking for an addictive Soulsvania to hack and slash through, The Devil Within Satgat will more than be enough to whet your appetite. And with its easier difficulty, there'll be no need to make a deal with the devil to actually beat it.